Did you know a pope once broke a rule that had stood in the church for generations, just so a 7-year-old could receive Jesus in the Eucharist? Pius X did. And bringing children to the altar wasn't even the boldest thing he did with his power. To understand why a poor country priest turned pope fought so hard for that, you have to go back to the day almost nobody expected him to become pope at all. An emperor spent months trying to keep one man off the papal throne. The plan worked, and made him pope anyway. Rome, August 2nd, 1903. 62 cardinals sit locked inside the Sistine Chapel to choose the next pope. A bishop from Krakow rises with a sealed letter, a veto from the Emperor of Austria-Hungary. Aimed at the cardinal almost everyone in that room expects to win. 2 days earlier, the bishop had met privately with the emperor in Vienna before continuing on to Rome, and the cardinals around him do not yet know what he is about to do. He begins to read, in Latin, on behalf of the Emperor of Austria-Hungary. He announces that His Apostolic Majesty, using an old and disputed privilege, forbids the election of one specific man. For a moment nobody moves, then the room breaks into confusion. The cardinals had not gathered inside these locked walls to hear an emperor's orders passed down through a messenger. Some stand in protest, and when the voting resumes, it is not the favorite who rises to Peter's chair. It is a cardinal nobody outside Italy had even considered. A man who, according to witnesses in the room, begged his brother cardinals in tears not to vote for him. His name was Giuseppe Melchiorre Sarto. History would remember him as Pius X. And the strangest part of his story is this. The same man an empire tried to put on the throne through political pressure would spend his first months as pope, tearing that very power out of the church forever. To understand what happened in that chapel, you have to understand who almost became pope instead of him. His name was Mariano Rampolla del Tindaro. He had served as Secretary of State under Pope Leo XIII for 16 years. The most experienced diplomat in the Vatican, fluent in the language of kings and chancelleries, respected across Europe, a man who had spent his adult life inside the exact rooms where church and empire negotiated with each other. Everyone assumed the papacy would simply pass to him. When the second ballot was counted that August morning, Rampolla had pulled ahead with 29 votes. Sarto trailed far behind with only 10. It was not yet decisive, but the direction was clear enough that every cardinal in that chapel could read it. Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria did not want Rampolla as pope. Years earlier, Rampolla had opposed granting a full Catholic burial to the emperor's own son after his death by suicide, a wound the emperor had never stopped carrying. Rampolla had also shown sympathy toward political forces the emperor considered dangerous to his empire. So Franz Joseph reached for a privilege that Catholic monarchs had claimed, on and off, since the 17th century, the so-called right of exclusion. A veto against one cardinal, delivered not by vote but by decree, and one that had not actually been used in centuries. It was never a right the church had actually granted. It was tolerated the way an old, uncomfortable custom is tolerated, nobody quite willing to be the one who finally refuses it. And on that second day of the conclave, it was used for what would turn out to be the last time in history. Giuseppe Sarto had grown up about as far from a throne as a man could grow up. He was born in 1835 in Riese, a small town in the Veneto countryside, the second of 10 children. His father worked for the local municipality carrying mail. His mother sewed clothes to help feed the family. As a boy, he walked for miles to reach school, often without shoes, to save the only pair the family owned for the return journey in bad weather. He entered the seminary, was ordained a priest, and spent decades doing the kind of work that never makes headlines. He served as a country chaplain in a small parish, then as an archpriest, then as spiritual director of the seminary that had trained him. He heard confessions for hours at a time. He taught catechism to children himself in person, rather than delegating it. Eventually he became Bishop of Mantua, and later Patriarch of Venice, a diocese he ran the way he had run every parish before it, visiting the sick, answering his own mail, keeping almost nothing for himself. What he never did, not once in all those years, was hold a position inside the Roman Curia or in Vatican diplomacy. He had never negotiated with a foreign government, never sat across a table from an ambassador. He was, by the time he entered that conclave, the first pope of the modern era to come entirely from a pastoral background, with no experience at all in the corridors of Vatican power. That detail matters because it is exactly what made him invisible to an emperor's calculations, and exactly what would define everything he did once he sat on Peter's chair. Back in the Sistine Chapel, the veto had just been read aloud. Cardinal Rampolla, the man it targeted, stood to protest along with the Camerlengo presiding over the conclave. Some cardinals wanted to ignore the emperor's letter entirely, arguing that political powers had no business dictating who would lead the church. According to the secretary of the conclave itself, the veto did not immediately hurt him. It may even have won him a few additional votes out of sheer indignation, but something had already shifted in that room. An election that outsiders were never meant to control had just been interrupted by an outsider, and in the ballots that followed, support began drifting toward the quiet patriarch of Venice, the pastoral man from Riza who had spent his life among ordinary parishioners, not princes. By the seventh ballot, Giuseppe Sarto was the clear choice of his brother cardinals. Witnesses in the chapel say he asked them more than once to reconsider, that he did not feel worthy, that this was not a burden he wanted, that they should look elsewhere. It did not change the outcome. When the votes were finally counted and the outcome was undeniable, he accepted in tears what the College of Cardinals had placed on him. He took the name Pius, he later explained, in honor of the popes before him, who had carried that name through great suffering for the church. A small signal, from the very first hour, of what kind of pontificate he expected to lead. The man an emperor had tried to keep out of power had just become pope because of the very attempt to control it. He had 11 years to prove whether that quiet beginning meant weakness or the opposite. Within months, Pius X acted to make certain no monarch would ever again interrupt a papal election that way. On the 20th of January, 1904, he issued the Apostolic Constitution Commissum Nobis, abolishing the so-called right of exclusion entirely. He went further than simply forbidding it. He attached the penalty of excommunication to anyone, cardinal or monarch, who tried to introduce a veto into a future conclave. The very mechanism that had, indirectly, placed him on the throne, he dismantled so completely that no pope after him would ever face it again. He chose a motto for his pontificate, drawn from St. Paul's letter to the Ephesians, Instaurare omnia in Christo, to restore all things in Christ. It was not a slogan chosen for effect. Almost everything he did as pope points back to that one sentence, applied with the instincts of a parish priest rather than a diplomat. He turned his attention first to the people furthest from the center of church life. Picture a small girl, no older than 7, standing in line at a parish altar rail for the first time, something that, before this pope, would not have been allowed to happen for years yet. In 1905, he wrote urging that ordinary Catholics, not just the specially devout, be encouraged toward frequent, even daily, communion. 5 years later, in the Decree Quam Singulari, he lowered the age at which children could receive their first communion to around 7 years old, the age of reason, instead of making them wait years longer as had become common practice. It reads like a small administrative change on paper. In practice, it meant that for the first time in generations, children across the Catholic world no longer had to wait to meet Christ at the altar. He pushed for the reform of sacred music, insisting that Gregorian chant be restored to its rightful place in the liturgy. He commissioned a new catechism, written in plain language, meant for people who had never studied theology. He encouraged the reform of biblical scholarship even as he moved firmly, and at times harshly, against theological currents he believed were eroding the church's foundations from within. He condemned what he called modernism in a series of documents, and he authorized a network of informants inside seminaries and universities to report on priests and professors suspected of holding those views. It was a defense of doctrine that many historians still see as necessary for its time, and others see as having gone further than it needed to, damaging reputations and careers along the way. Both things can be true of the same pontificate, and a fair account of his life has to hold them together rather than erase one to protect the other. He was not only a man of decrees, though. When earthquakes devastated Calabria and Messina in 1908, killing tens of thousands, he appealed to Catholics around the world for help and personally raised millions of francs for the survivors. He responded the same way to the eruption of Vesuvius and to disasters in Portugal and Ireland, not as a distant administrator issuing statements, but as a parish priest who happened to be responsible for the whole world. And he kept living, as Pope, the way he had lived as the son of a mail carrier. He refused to let his relatives take advantage of his position, famously keeping his own family in modest circumstances rather than allowing them to profit from his name. Some of his sisters continued living simply in Rome, and he made sure no one used his name to secure favors or money. He broke with the tradition of popes dining alone, opening the papal table to visitors and old friends, the way a village priest might invite neighbors in for supper. He trusted his Secretary of State, Cardinal Rafael Meri del Val, as a close friend as much as a collaborator, and together the two men carried a workload that those around them described as relentless. driven, everyone agreed. Less by ambition than by a simple inability to say no to work that needed doing. When people addressed him with the reverence due a saint, he would smile and correct them with a small joke on his own surname. Not Santo, he would say, just Sarto. It was the kind of joke a man makes when he has not forgotten where he came from, even after the world has started treating him like someone extraordinary. In his will, he left behind a single sentence that summarized the whole shape of his life. I was born poor, I lived poor, and I want to die poor. For most of his pontificate, that quiet, stubborn goodness seemed to carry him forward without much resistance. Then, in 1913, his health broke. He suffered a heart attack, and from that point on he lived, as those close to him described it, in the shadow of a body that was failing. The following summer, on the Feast of the Assumption, the 15th of August, 1914, he fell seriously ill. It was an illness he would not recover from, and it arrived at almost the exact moment Europe was tearing itself apart. Weeks earlier, an assassination in Sarajevo had set off a chain of alliances and declarations that, within days, pulled nation after nation into what would become the First World War. Pius X had feared this for some time. According to those around him, he had spoken of the coming catastrophe before it fully arrived, and when it did, he said this would be the last suffering God would send him. That he would gladly give his own life if it could spare his people from the calamity now unfolding. He did not get that trade. The war did not stop, and his body, already weakened by the heart attack the year before, gave way further under a severe attack of bronchitis in the days that followed. On the 20th of August 1914, Pope Pius X died. It was not even a month since the war had begun. On that same day, German forces occupied Brussels. A leading figure of the Jesuit order had died only hours earlier. Historians would later note that the man whose entire pontificate had been built around restoring peace and simplicity to the Church closed his eyes on a day when the continent was actively marching toward ruin. He spent much of his final day unconscious, but at one point, according to accounts from those present, he spoke, and what he said was not about doctrine or legacy or the Church he was leaving behind. He said that in earlier centuries, a pope's authority, his power to excommunicate a king, to pressure Catholic nations through the weight of the Church alone, might once have been enough to hold a war like this one back. Now, he said, that authority had reached its limit. He was, in his own description, powerless. His last recorded words were simpler still. I resign myself completely. The Pope, who had spent 11 years quietly dismantling every claim earthly power tried to make on the Church. The man who had refused to let an emperor's veto stand, who had told cardinals not to vote for him, who had corrected people for calling him a saint, someone whose state died, admitting that he could not stop the one catastrophe he had feared the most. There is a strange symmetry in that. In 1903, a monarch had tried to use political force to keep this man off the papal throne, and failed. In 1914, that same man, now dying, watched monarchs and empires drag the world into war, and found he had no political force left to stop them either. The power he had spent his whole pontificate refusing to hoard for himself was never the kind of power that could have prevented Sarajevo, or the armies now crossing into Belgium. It never was that kind of power. It was something else entirely. The small, unglamorous kind that shows up in a decree protecting a conclave's freedom, in a 7-year-old walking up to receive communion for the first time. The same scene this story opened with. In a pope who ate dinner with strangers instead of alone. He had spent his life restoring what belonged to Christ, one small act at a time, never claiming to control the things that were never his to control. And when the moment came that he could not stop, the one no one could have stopped by decree or by prayer alone, he did not pretend otherwise. He simply resigned himself completely, the same way he had lived without illusions about his own power, and without losing his trust in the one who actually held it. He was beatified in 1951 and canonized on the 29th of May 1954 by Pope Pius XII, the first pope to be raised to the altar since Pius V, canonized in 1712, over 2 centuries earlier. 2 healings recognized in the process leading to his canonization involved people who had turned to his intercession in serious illness. His body rests today beneath the altar of the chapel of the Presentation in St. Peter's Basilica, visible through glass, still reachable by anyone who walks in to ask for his prayers. Maybe that is the real lesson in this story. Not that a good man rose to power despite an emperor's veto, and not even that a good man died feeling powerless in the face of war. It is that both of those things were true of the same person in the same lifetime, and neither one changed who he actually was. There will be things you cannot stop, no matter how much you wanted to give your own life to prevent them. Pius X knew that better than most people ever will. He had spent 11 years proving that quiet faithfulness could dismantle even a centuries-old claim of political power over the church. And at the very end, none of that was enough to stop one war. He did not have a decree for that. He did not have a motu proprio that could reach Sarajevo or Brussels or the armies already crossing into Belgium the day he died. And still, his last words were not despair. They were surrender. The kind that trusts God even when a man has run out of power, out of words, out of time. He did not die pretending he had won. He died admitting exactly what he could not do and handing the rest to God anyway. If there is a war you are fighting right now that you cannot win by force of will, a diagnosis, a family falling apart, a fear you cannot argue your way out of, you do not have to pretend you can control it. You are allowed to say what he said. I resign myself completely, not as defeat, as trust. Saint Pius X, pray for us, for the Church, for those who carry more than they can hold, and for anyone tonight who needs to hand over what they cannot fix on their own.